good soldier in a rotten war, sir.
What is up, guys? GearIssue33 here, and today we are reviewing The Beast of War, an underrated gem of a film that has recently got some attention here online, seeing how it is actually available here on YouTube, and I just made a link in the description box for you guys. But it's the 1988 war film starring Jason Patric and George Zunda, whom I'm probably going to call George Da Zunda from time to time because of the spelling of his name. Stephen Bauer is also in this film, as well as the character of Taj, and it's based on a Soviet tank crew in the early days of the conflict in Afghanistan between the Soviet Union and the Afghan people. And it deals with the question of whether you are loyal to your nation or your ideals, or at least the times. The film's protagonist, Constantine, played by Patrick, a soldier with baggage and a past, is forced to deal with an old-school tank commander in Daskal, played by Zunda. It explores the struggle of paranoia of each other inside of a tank, while in the nation known as the Graveyard of Empires. The film, of course, has become a bit of a cult classic, like I said before, also thanks to its online presence. It's been getting a lot more notoriety than it got at the time it was released, which, by the way, we'll be explaining a little bit more in the very end of the film, especially when we get to the themes, but we'll get there here in a second. The story is actually an adaptation of a play titled Nenewante, which explores the Afghan custom of Pastuaini. This film is also directed by Kevin Reynolds, the original scriptwriter of the original Red Dawn, which was originally called 10 Soldiers, but once again, a film we'll be looking at in the near future. The film at the time, like I said, it just didn't get much notoriety, but of course it's been pushed heavily here online. You can find it if you just simply type in The Beast of War. It's available for free on YouTube. Now, before we actually review this film and actually go into the actual themes and what it's really and truly about and what the overall message is of this film, which, by the way, will be in the conclusion section, I want to tell you how this video is going to go. I'm going to run through the plot, which is probably going to be the largest section of the video itself, and I'm going to be primarily focusing on the Russian side, but I'm definitely going to be splicing in the Afghan villagers' pursuit of the tank itself. And also something else too, there's going to be little tiny bits and pieces in the film as far as the plot's concerned. They're going to be pointing out and explaining along the way. But that right there out of the way, let's go ahead and dive into The Beast of War. Our story opens with the tank crew traveling near a nearby village as a part of an overall strike on said village. Now, I want to go ahead and say this right quick before we go any further. The soundtrack of this film, or at least the opening sound to the film itself, has kind of a really, which I'm playing a part of it for you guys now at a very low tune, but I'll probably link the actual soundtrack in the description box for you guys. It has kind of a melancholy type vibe to it. It's a very pretty sound if you just sit back and listen to it. It makes me almost think about Sloop John B by the Beach Boys, but still, though, not to blow too much smoke up the soundtrack's rear, let's go ahead and get back to the plot. So the tank, of course, platoon, in the second year now of the Afghan-Soviet conflict, they are attacking the village. And of course, after the crew begins to settle down, they all dismount and provide more carnage on the village, meaning that they obviously destroy the place. And in a scene that I'm not allowed to show you, Constantine, our tank driver, is ordered to run over one of the Afghans in the village itself. Shortly after the crew leaves, Taj, played by Stephen Bauer, arrives to see that his village is destroyed. The man being crushed by the tank, that would turn out to be his brother, and of course his cousin Muhammad would show up, and arguments do in fact ensue. However, they do ultimately decide to go find the tank, and of course by trying to find the tank, they also feel that this mission is also somewhat divine, but that right there will also come up a little bit later on in the story. Our crew stops to do a little bit of maintenance, and the crew's Afghan interpreter, Samad, who, by the way, you may have seen bits of him in the beginning of the actual review itself, he is relieved of his position after not being able to point out a, let's just say, a little important piece of information that's on their map that they're going to need later on. This, by the way, will pop up later on in the review. Samad is the crew's interpreter, and he also aids the Soviets in many ways, including intel on customs, Afghan way of life, but ultimately he is chewed out by Daskal for incompetence and relieved. Constantine, of course, basically tells him to just simply stay out of Daskal's way. Daskal is old school, and like I said, we'll talk more about him towards the end of the film and, of course, throughout this particular review, so that way you guys get an idea of exactly why he is the way he is. While doing some temporary maintenance, the villagers ultimately catch up to the tank, and eventually the tank crew escapes and sets up an ambush and even poisons the water, so that way when the villagers come up, they get poisoned by the water itself. Obviously shady tactic, but it is war, and things are done that quite frankly are pretty daggone underhanded. While in waiting for the ambush, the tank suffers a misfire and the crew bolts out of the tank. Dascal, of course, is growing more and more paranoid of Samad possibly being a traitor, and he and Constantine go back into the tank to handle the cook-off. And of course the two begin to discuss Samad, and Constantine, having a bit of a soft spot for Samad, basically says, look, I don't think he's cut out for this line of work. And eventually, after this, the crew does get up and they do eventually leave. This is once the villagers begin to actually take off. But of course, once the crew gets to an actual spot of rest, they begin to have conversations. They begin to relax. It's nighttime. Fire is set. And of course, Constantine and Samad, they have a very interesting conversation. And of course, this conversation is about the Afghan custom of Pastuaini.
Mastia, hospitality.
Milmastia.
Second, badal, revenge.
Badal.
Third, Nenewante, the obligation to give sanctuary to all those who ask.
To all.
All?
Even the enemy.
All.
What if I kill your brother? And you come for Badal, revenge. And I ask for Nenewante.
Then I would be obligated to feed, clothe, and protect you.
It's incredibly civilized. What is it? Nenewante.
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 Bread?
Corvedon.
There is another thing that will be touched on later on in the review, so just think of this as foreshadowing because there's definitely a lot more to go into, but it'll be coming up more in the themes and when the actual situation goes to crap. But eventually a fight breaks out between Kaminsky, who I've not mentioned yet, the gunner of the tank, who's played by Don Harvey, and our loader Belikov, who's played by a very young Stephen Baldwin. And this fight, of course, being broken up, eventually leads to the discovery by Dascal that Kaminsky has been draining the crew's brake fluid and been using it as a type of field liquor. Reprimanded by Dascal, yet also threatened to be written up by Constantine, Dascal chooses not to do this, seeing how it is that Kaminsky is the best gunner in the platoon, the best gunner in the battalion. However, the crew is immediately ambushed by the Afghans, and the crew eventually sets off. They eventually do, in fact, escape under the ambush, and while being attacked, they find themselves in the position to where they have to set up defenses, of course, and eventually the tank does begin to fire off all their small arms. The tank, of course, the crew themselves are in fact safe. This is a T-54, T-55 tank, and they actually did a very, very good job of finding a model for this tank to use in this film, but we may discuss that a little bit more when we get to a Red Dawn review, because that work that was done on that film was actually very good. And by the way, Kevin Reynolds, once again, he originally wrote the script. It just so happened to be that John Milius was the one guy who actually came in, reworked the script, and directed the film. But back to the film at hand. The crew, of course, is hemmed in, but they do eventually survive the night. Now, during this process, Dascal grows more and more paranoid of Samad, and seeing an opportunity to end Samad, Samad is sent outside, where he, of course, scours the land to see exactly if they hit something or not. And Dascal does tell Constantine to kill Samad, but before Constantine can ultimately make a decision, Samad comes back into the tank to inform them that the only thing they've killed is a deer. The following morning, the men are trying to cross the stream, and Samad, he is trying to pray. He's trying to get himself in the mental focus to pray, and Dascal's paranoia picks up. Dascal sees as an opportunity to get rid of Samad. Now, Samad, and I did not play this clip before, but you'll definitely see it more at the very end, he was kind of tipped off to Dascal's paranoia, and he promptly reminds, or really in a lot of ways, he kind of begs to say, look, you know, my son's in the cultural exchange, I'm an ardent communist, I'm very, very pro-Soviet Union, all that type of stuff there to try to, you know, I guess you could say try to plead with Dascal, but Dascal's not having this. He wants Samad to go into the water and check the waters. I wouldn't say the depth, but definitely the texture. He wants to know if it's mud or if it's rock. This opportunity, of course, comes Descal's way, and Descal immediately ends what he perceives to be a problem, which is Samad. Constantine, of course, pops up and he unleashes on Descal, which eventually leads to this exchange later on in the tank.
When I was 8 years old, defending Stalingrad, I didn't think for myself. When the motherland asked for our lives, we gave. My father didn't think of himself, he gave. My mother didn't think of herself, she gave. My brother didn't think of himself, he gave. My comrades tied a rope around my waist and lowered me on top of Nazi tanks. I stuffed Molotovs under turret and cannon, and then they pulled me up again. 8 years old. They called me Tank Boy. I took a lot of Nazi tanks. A lot. And over the years, I've learned to smell a traitor.
You see, gang, one of the main points of this particular film is that it's also about a generational divide, and you guys obviously heard Descal's reasons for feeling the way he feels. You know, go back to what he just said. We gave. They called me Tank Boy. They used me to take out tanks in Stalingrad fighting the Nazis. Descal obviously comes up from a different environment, a different time, and of course this will come up again towards the end of the film, but Descal, as you guys can see, is obviously old school. And you may think that maybe he felt that his suspicions of Samad at the time could have been justified, but like I said before, there was another aspect that I did not show you guys, which I'm going to show you guys now.
Time.
Listen to me. When the old man gets on your back, there's no way to shake him off.
My dear Constantine, I regard this abuse as the price I must pay to learn. I love Afghanistan, but we are a flea in the tail of a bear. We must join the 20th century. When Afghans accept that, I will be there, knowing technology and Russian.
So you're a patriot?
Yes.
Well, so is that rebel. He wanted to keep things the way they've always been. I wish I believed in something that much. I envy him.
Then why did you crush him?
Because I had no choice.
You always have a choice.
Give it, Kaminsky.
Now, like I said before, this film is actually an adaptation of another story called Nenewante. Now, I did not mention the name earlier, but I did mention that it was actually an adaptation of another story. And Nenewante basically means mercy. This is what you're going to say before you decide to go and try to get yourself taken in by Afghan villagers, which we'll get back to here in a second. The point is this here. Constantine kind of had an idea where this was going. He had not reached that point to where he could actually see it happening, but he definitely knew it was on the way, and he had already informed Samad that, yeah, this guy's paranoia is obviously picking up, and regardless of how pro-Russia you may be, it is very possible that Descal does not care. By the way, this will come up a little bit later on when we get to another point in the story, but let's get back to it. Eventually, the crew stops to do maintenance, and while doing maintenance, a conversation is had, and that conversation basically involves Constantine informing Descal that the tank is pretty much shot. The batteries are about to die, the tank is leaking oil, and also the brakes are gone. The tank is, quite frankly, on its last legs, and surrender is hinted at. Now, I want to go ahead and point this out now. I originally wanted to put this in the end of the film, but I think what Constantine was trying to do is he was trying to get the crew to overcome Descal, mostly due to the paranoia. You'll pick up on this here in a second. But eventually, what happens is that Descal decides to tie Constantine up to a rock. He puts a grenade down there, and of course this scene here, which by the way would make you think that possibly what Constantine wanted was for the crew to basically overtake Descal, and you'll see here.
You're next.
I can't.
You hear me, Anton?
Yes, telling Belikov that you're next. Basically, Descal's not going to need you anymore. You see, Kaminsky, even though he was the gunner, he immediately became the driver when the tank took off. Now, Descal decided to leave Constantine on that rock to buy him some time from the pursuing Afghans, which we'll get to here in a second. The point that I'm trying to make is that it's very possible that what Constantine was looking to do was trying to get the tank overtaken so that way they could eventually surrender, because their situation, according to him, appeared to be hopeless. Now, somebody may think that this right here is being a traitor, but also at the exact same time, if you've watched the film, then you will know that Constantine is actually a pretty smart guy. Now, with that right there being said, the crew, they do eventually take off. We'll get back to the crew in a second, but let's go ahead and focus in on the Afghans. The women from the village have actually been pursuing the men the entire time. There's a nice little scene that I've kind of fuzzed out a little bit of the ladies showing up, and eventually the ladies, they're the ones who eventually come up on Constantine's, I would say body, but he was obviously still alive. They immediately proceed to stone him, and of course, Constantine begins to scream Nenewante, which was the word that was taught to him by Samad. Eventually, the men show up, and when the men show up, they have a bit of an argument about that phrase, Nenewante. Do we take him in? Do we feed him? What do we do? He may be of some use as we are pursuing this tank. Now, to talk about the Afghan villagers for a very quick second, I want to talk about them very, just temporarily for a second, and then get to the next plot point before we get back to the tank crew. The Afghans in this particular film, it just feels like this situation is divine. There's even a situation where the Afghanis come across an elder who is by a fire, and he's kind of like moving around, dancing, doing some religious stuff. And of course, he kind of gives off the indication that you're David and the tank is Goliath, which is kind of a scene that might make you think that this situation is divine for these Afghanis to find or catch up with the tank so that way they can destroy it. It's basically the tank, of course, is Goliath, and the men, of course, are David. And, of course, the RPG that they have is the rock, or the sling in the rock. Eventually, the group finds themselves inside of a cave where Constantine ultimately teaches them exactly what to do. Or a better phrase would be, they give him the RPG, they give him the rocket launcher, and he repairs it for them. And, of course,
kaboom. Kaboom. Kaboom.
If you've seen this film, then therefore you probably know about that scene, or you probably know about that sequence. But getting back to our tank crew. Our tank crew eventually gets lost. You see, guys, remember that spot that I was talking about where that little part on the map that they could not find was because it was burned out. If you guys remember correctly, Daskal relieved Samad of his duties, even though Samad is obviously still in the tank. But still, though, they couldn't find it. Luckily for our tank crew, however, a Russian helicopter does come by. And, of course, they eventually meet up with this helicopter. However, yeah, just as our loader and our gunner are beginning to get, let's just say, chummy with the idea of possibly going back to the firm base, yeah, this scene here happens.
Okay.
Get back in the tank.
What for?
Because I said so.
We're going home, sir.
In the tank.
Why can't we go home in a fucking helicopter?
Because you're tankers.
Yeah, you're also in a cul-de-sac.
You showed up in a tank, you're leaving in a tank. You are tankers, you are going back in that vehicle. You are going home in that tank. Now, I want to go ahead and say this really quick. I'm a prior service U.S. Marine Corps tanker, M1A1. My first deployment was late 2004, OIF-2 TAC-2, Operation Phantom Fury. I'm not going to go too much into my record, but trust me, I understand what it's like to be a tanker. I was not that great at my job as a tanker. Believe me, there are actual functions on that vehicle that you need to learn how to do. I was a driver, but still, though, tanking can suck. It looks cool, but it can suck, especially with an Abrams, which quite frankly is a logistical nightmare, and it's constantly broken down. So I obviously feel these guys' pain. Now back to the story. Eventually our tank crew does eventually leave, but the Afghans do in fact catch up with said tank crew. They begin to fire on the tank fires back, the tank takes off, and the tank of course is trying to get to the actual pass. In order for them to get to the pass on the other side that would eventually lead them back to base, they have to go through this valley. Constantine and Taj, of course, they lead the charge to get to the pass itself, or to the valley, to try to catch the tank. Of course, the chase picks up. And of course, this is actually a very good chase. I'm not going to lie to you. It's actually very, very well done. As I've said before, This film didn't get much notoriety back when it was released, but it's, like I said before, it's gotten a lot of notoriety since. It's become a bit of a cult classic, especially for tankers and veterans. And you guys can obviously see why here in the B-roll footage. This chase is actually a very good chase, which ultimately culminates with, of course, is what you're seeing now. It culminates with the main gun tube getting exploded, but of course, if you're a tanker, then you would know that the main gun or the muzzle getting destroyed is not the end of the tank. However, what you're seeing now with these rocks falling down on top of the tank, and of course the track coming off, thanks of course to the ladies planting a bunch of grenades under said rock, that right there, my friends, would be the end of the tank, at least in a mobility sense. The tank can obviously still survive, but then a Molotov cocktail gets thrown at the guys, and of course, as they're sitting in there, as the heat begins to rise, obviously one final standing order is in place, which is to simply just become heroes, seeing as you can't go anywhere else and to end yourself. However, the crew is obviously not having this, as you guys can see. Ultimately, the tank crew is forced to come out, and of course under duress. You probably think that the Afghans would definitely take these men prison, or if they didn't take them prisoner, maybe if they understood the phrase Nenewante, then maybe it's possible that they could be taken in, but that of course does not happen. Ultimately, what ends up happening is, as you guys are seeing in the B-roll footage, Dascal and the men, they are forced to leave. Now, Constantine, he chooses to stay behind, of course, and of course he's waiting for the next Soviet helicopter to come in. Or at least when the Soviet helicopter does come in, he now takes this as an opportunity to basically signal Mayday and of course leave. And of course Taj is sitting there looking up, seeing his Russian friend or his Russian ally go up into the sky, obviously never to be seen again. Of course, Dascal and the men, as you guys are seeing here in the B-roll footage, obviously things don't end so well for them. Now, with that right there being said, let's go ahead and dive into what this film was trying to say.
Sorry, sir. Not much of a war. No Stalingrad. How is it that we're the Nazis this time? How is it? I tried to be a good soldier. But you can't be a good soldier in a rotten war, sir. And I want you to live to see them win. Go.
I played that 30 some odd second clip for you guys, and I did that with it inside of a header like I do all the clips that do play. This is done obviously to avoid copyright, and of course if I've got to re-upload this, and of course I'm editing this right here on a Friday night, if there's like little headers over the speech, this because, well, I'm trying to avoid copyright. That's the reason why that obviously came out not the way I wanted it. But the thing is this right here: how can you be a good soldier in a rotten war? How is it that we're the Nazis this time? I'm not so sure that Russian men felt that way during the Soviet-Afghanistan war. I'm not here to give you guys a big-time history lesson, but still, though, I'm not so sure that's the case. I'm only speaking from my personal experience as a former U.S. Marine. I didn't feel guilty about the mission that I was given, even though we get panned about the Iraq war all the time, but still, though, I never actually felt guilty about it. The orders I was given do I think about it to this day? Yeah, from time to time, but I think that the idea of this was to try to strike a chord with the audience, so that way the audience could kind of see that there were Russians that possibly did not feel good about the war that they were fighting. By the way, Konstantin Korvachenko, his character in a lot of ways is left morally gray because of the actual mission. I'm pretty sure that a lot of Russians, a lot of people who live in the Soviet Union who may have come across this film might have actually looked at Konstantin and they probably would have thought to themselves, this guy's actually a traitor. Some more old school types, which we'll get to in a second. But the theme that I got, or at least the underlying theme when it came from Konstantin, was that he was a guy who, quite frankly, just did not care about the war. There's also sequences like what I'm going to show you now.
Just tell me one thing, Kovachenko. Why do you stick up for the Afghan?
Because he's doing the best he can, sir.
That's what worries me. You got what it takes, Kovachenko. I've seen it. Just keep your head on straight.
Where it's kind of played up to the fact that Konstantin is a soldier who's worth a lot. There's even a sequence right before Constantine is basically ordered to kill Samad, where Descal points out, dude, there's really nowhere else for you to go in this military except for prison. Of course, it didn't happen because Samad came into the tank before Korvachenko could even make the decision to pull the trigger. But the thing is this right here. Konstantin Korvachenko is played up more or less to be the morally justified person, but in the end, he ends up coming off much, much more gray. Which, of course, leads us to this generation gap. You see, earlier when you guys were looking in the B-roll footage, which I'm showing you guys again now, where Descal was about to basically end himself with the tank crew, because those were the standing orders. If you get to a position where you can't really do anything and we become heroes, that's kind of where he came from. Go back to the sequence where he said, we didn't think about this, we just simply gave. We just simply gave whatever the motherland asked us. That's how they were raised back in those days, especially given the fact that they were fighting the Nazis at that point in time, which is very interesting too. How is that Korvachenko, who's obviously much, much smarter and much, much more educated, it's funny how it was that he asked the question, how is it that we are the Nazis this time? The point is this right here. Descal is so old school that Descal is going to follow orders all the way to his dying breath. He has already decided to put his life on the line for the motherland. That's the truth about Descal. Now, being old school is good, and I think that in this film, a lot of his paranoia, while it was not justified, in a lot of ways you could kind of understand why he was the way he was. As I said before, the guy obviously fought in defense of the motherland against a very, very powerful enemy in the Nazis during World War II. And of course, Stalingrad's probably the bloodiest battle in world history. It may be the bloodiest battle. By the way, there'll be a video out in the near future on about who really won World War II. But still, though, the point is this right here. Descal was old school. Descal's experience led him to be the way he was. But as I said before, it's that generational gap that the youngsters obviously did not have. Go back to also the sequence when he said get back in the tank. Obviously, these young men, Belikov and Kaminsky, they were so daggone excited about being able to get out of there that it might make you think they were almost childlike. But there's one more sequence that I do want to point out, and that's going back to the moment that Descal found out that Kaminsky was using the brake fluid as alcohol, or as field liquor. Constantine wants to write him up. Descal's not having this. We need our gunner. We need our gunner in good shape. We need our gunner focused. We don't need our gunner thinking about a charge that's coming to him, which, by the way, in the Soviet military could have gotten him hung. This is kind of like, taking care of things, in-house, which is something that old school personnel love to do. With that right there being said, though, let me go ahead and give you guys my final thoughts on the film. As I've said before, this right here was an underrated gem of a film, and you can see it for free on YouTube. Kevin Reynolds, of course, the highest profile project I think he directed after this was the original, not the original, Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, starring Kevin Costner. He's the guy who originally wrote the script for Red Dawn, which was originally called 10 Soldiers. It was eventually reworked and turned into Red Dawn by John Milius. So obviously Kevin Reynolds is somebody who's known. But the final points in the film is that I think the biggest reason why it went so under the radar was more because of the fact that the Afghan war was already ending. It technically was over in 1985. Maybe some additional action was going on post that. But there is one more film that takes place around the Afghan war, or takes place with the Afghan war being the setting between them and the Soviet Union, and that's Rambo 3, a Sylvester Stallone flick that obviously did not succeed at the box office that year anyways. That's probably the real reason why, is because the overall interest in the Soviet-Afghan war was gone. Well, guys, that right there about wraps it up. Make sure you guys please hit the like button. Please leave a comment in the comment section. Please critique this. Also, something else too, the next video that gets released will probably be a video of just the normal type video to explain how the process of how things are going to work on the channel going forward. Please leave a comment. Please critique the actual video. If you find anything wrong, please say so in the comment section. I would love to get you guys feedback. Still though, please hit the like button, subscribe, share the video, sign off in the comment section, and I'll see you guys later.